Hello and welcome to this repair tutorial, and today we're going to look at a Technics, and the model number is SU and it's the X955 amplifier. In terms of general specifications, power output is 60 watts into 8 ohms, and from the front fascia you can select system A and system B, and you have independent speaker terminals on the rear. You can go to a maximum of 16 ohms in terms of speaker impedance if you wish. Frequency response is 10 Hz to 40 kHz, and then total harmonic distortion is 0.009%. And then for your inputs, you can connect directly a moving magnet type cartridge from a turntable, and that is 3 millivolts. And then your CD input is 200 millivolts, and then your tuner, aux, tape, and you have both selections for tape 1 and tape 2, is 150 millivolts. Now the unit also has an optical input as well as a digital input. So if you connect then from the optical input, you can see here that the CD and DAT has a frequency range of 15 Hz to 20 kHz. But once you connect then to the optical, what's a really nice feature is just below the main display, you have 3 LEDs, and they will illuminate to identify, for example, if the sample frequency is 32 kHz, if you have the CD input, then it's 44.1 kHz, and then for all others, it will be 48 kHz. And then on the rear, you have an output connection, and here you can have your record output for whichever input you select. And then you also have independent outputs for both tape 1 and tape 2. Signal there is 150 millivolts. You also have individual controls for your bass, treble and balance, and also a headphone socket for private listening. And then again, what is a really nice feature is you have this super bass. So you will select that from the front fascia of the amplifier, and that will give you an increase of plus 10 dB, and it is significant when you're listening to it. Also as well, the amplifier supports additional speaker connections for surround sound, and again, when you select that mode, it is very, very impressive. I'm quite a fan of these amplifiers. I've repaired them over many years and the different model numbers within this range. And then here in terms of dimensions, you're looking at the width, depth and height, so that's 460 by 300 by 128 millimeters, and then the weight of the amplifier comes in at 6.8 kilograms. Now, when you look from the top of the amplifier, you can see there, let's use the word complicated, because there is an extensive use of digital technology throughout the amplifier, so really advanced at the time when this amplifier was sold. So if we look from the left hand side, you have the main input power connection, but you also have the additional connection if you want to power other devices. The large block, that is the EI power transformer. And then just to the right of there, that is where you have the dedicated optical board that you can see. And then we can then also make out the 2 large electrolytic smoothing capacitors. Those are the black components stood up. And then you can also see as well the main audio output IC, and that's bolted to the heatsink. And then you can also see that there is a fin type radiator to the rear, and there is also a cooling fan. Sometimes the cooling fan can be a little bit confusing because it's maybe believed that once it turns on, then it should remain on until everything cools, or it should be running permanently. It's actually linked to the dynamic signal coming in. So maybe, for example, you have a dramatic increase, initially during a song that you're playing. You may even find that relatively low volume, the fan will spin for maybe 2 to 3 seconds. Of course, if you're running it at higher power, again, because of the dynamic range, it may be such that the fan will then continue to run. And then on the right hand side you can see your inputs, and there is a switch on the rear where you can select digital or analog for the CD input. And we'll come to the issues relating to what we found with this amplifier in a moment. And then when we look from the rear, there's a number of things which we need to highlight. The first one is I've drawn a circle around these interconnecting links. It is very, very common that at some point in time these links get removed when it was part of the stack system. The issue then is that you see these amplifiers again coming up for sale, and the links are missing, and the complaint raised will be that there is very, very low audio. So you need to always ensure that these links are in place if you're going to use it, as in this case, as a single integrated amplifier, and you're not looking to connect, for example, the output from the preamplifier to another amplifier. You can also see the cooling fan, and it's not uncommon that you can see this heavy layer of dust, so it's relatively easy to remove it. It just unclips from the rear, and then you can just unplug it, and it's the same board that you see where we have the interconnectors, and then just simply wipe out the dust. You also have some other additional interconnectors where they would connect to the other devices within the stack system. And then on the right hand side you can see the different speaker terminals. Just above the one speaker terminal you can see the optical input. You also have the auxiliary mains power where you connect, for example, your tuner or maybe a graphic equalizer. You can see that this board has extensive layout in terms of electronic components because it's handling both a digital signal, if selected, as well as analog. So what you need to do is, once the back panel is removed, as with many of the tutorials, as I said, we're just highlighting particular areas of interest. So the most common areas is where you get these stress points. And here what I've done is I've just reflowed all of the RCA input sockets, and probably 3 to 4 of them were cracked. So they would have resulted in intermittent sound. And then here what you can see is that this is the dedicated small circuit board, and this is where you have the speaker terminals. And again, it's a stress point, so you need to reflow those connections. Here 2 of them were cracked. And then what you do is you raise up the board from the main chassis. So there's a series of locking screws, and once you remove them, you can see here what I've done is I've just highlighted areas that you need to look at. The most common one is where you see the radiated heatsink. Those pins are for the audio output device. You'll always find drive joints around there. And then as we look from this photograph here to the right hand side, this is where you have 3 series regulator power supply transistors, and there are always dry solder joints because they run very, very hot. There's also another multi-pin voltage regulator. Again, it runs hot, so you need to desolder and then resolder. And then you also have the multi-pin connectors where the amplifier board plugs into the main front board, and you'll often find cracks around there. Also on the pins where the analog/digital board plugs into the amplifier board, and then just at the rear, just the interconnections for the auxiliary devices. You need to reflow those. Now, when this amplifier came in, the complaint was, or the issue raised was, that the amplifier didn't turn on. But actually, that was incorrect. And the reason why it was incorrect is when the amplifier was powered up, what you could hear was the speaker protection relay change over, but there was no visual indication of anything happening on the front fascia. So I mean here that the main display was not illuminating, and there was no LED indication. If you pressed any of the buttons, again, you didn't see anything. Now what you see here is at some point in time someone has attempted to resolder these series regulator transistors, and this needed to be corrected because there's really an excess amount of solder. So these were all desoldered, and then you also have to check as well some of the solder tracks. Some are very, very thin, and because it's heat related they can lift from the board, so you just need to ensure with continuity that those are making the necessary contact, and then of course the connection to the rest of the circuit board. Now what I'm showing here is the extract from the service manual, and what we're focusing is on the series regulator components within the power supply, and you have multiple power supplies. So here again is the photograph of the circuit board before it was resoldered with the series regulator transistors, and you can see here that it provides multiple voltages, both positive and negative, and then from the main power supply, after rectification and smoothing, it will then go to additional regulators. So here, once this work had been done, i.e. we made sure that there was no broken tracks associated with these series regulator transistors, what was done is to verify that you had all of the correct DC voltages, and there was no issue. So that meant that potentially there could well be a problem on the microprocessor or microcontroller board stroke tone board. So if you unplug the amplifier board, there you can see that that is the tone stroke micro board, and there are the series of interconnectors where the main amp board plugs in. You'll often find dry solder joints there, so of course we reflow them because a number of them were cracked. And then what I'll do is I'll just re-plug back in the amp board and then power it up. But we still didn't have any illumination at all. And then here what you can see is that the microcontroller board stroke tone board has just been unplugged from the other board, and I'll come to that in a moment. And what you can see straight away is just above the large multi-pin integrated circuit, which is the microcontroller, you can see the display. What I'm highlighting also is that it is very common over time is that this display gets a heavy layer of dust, and then also through the viewing window you'll get heavy layer of dust as well. At the same time, when this board is removed, you can also spray into the user controls, so this is the bass, treble and balance controls, De-Oxit, and just rotate them backwards and forwards just to clean up the carbon tracks. And then also as well, what you can sometimes find is that the grease around the shafts of the potentiometers has dried, so they may be difficult to turn. So if you just spray a small amount of Service-Sol Super 10 switch cleaner just around there, it will quickly dissolve that excess grease, and they'll run really, really smoothly. So what did we have to do? Well, we knew that the power supply voltages were all present. So the next thing that we have to verify is what's going on with the microcontroller, because the microcontroller also provides the output to the display, and of course it's receiving all the different input signals as well as driving the output signals to the LEDs, etc. So there's really three areas which are of interest. The first one is to verify that the power is reaching the microcontroller, which it was. We had the power supply and there wasn't any issue there. The next thing to check is to verify to make sure that the CPU or microcontroller is not in reset, which it wasn't. And then the next thing we needed to verify is the clock oscillator for the microcontroller running? And it wasn't running. Now, sometimes what can be the issue is that the resonator, or should we use the term here, the crystal, may be faulty. So that means that the clock within the microcontroller, it cannot run. I checked the crystal and there was no issue at all. And if you see here as we zoom in, you can see that this is a 4 megahertz crystal. That's what we're looking at. And then the next thing to do is really to remove the main board, and that's what you're seeing here. And you can see that it comes with the LED board, and this doesn't unplug. It's like a one piece. You can of course desolder it. But remember, to remove this board completely from the front fascia, you do need to desolder the volume control encoder. And then what you also got on here as well are the switches where, for example, you will select the different inputs and they're just above the series of red LEDs. And then also where you'll select, for example, your surround sound and then your super bass. Now, the microcontroller is obsolete, so it's not possible to source a new one. And remember that the microcontroller, when it's provided to the OEM, Technics, it would have no firmware inside because they put the program code into the device. So the only way in which we could repair this amplifier was to use a donor. So it was a case of desoldering the multi-pin microcontroller and then transferring it over then onto the defective board. And as soon as that was done, and then you powered up the amplifier once it had been reassembled, then you had the display on immediately. What I would also say as well is that the display had to be replaced. Now, with these displays, you have the grid, and then over a period of time, you get almost like oxidization internally, and then the filaments within the display will start to become very, very dim. Now, these types of displays were used extensively during this time period on VCRs and other pieces of domestic electronics. What I did was I just took the display from the donor board and then put it into this unit, and then you could see a very clear, bright indication. And then when we look from the rear of the amplifier here, just to the left hand side is where you see the volume encoder. Now, what happens with the volume encoder is that the original lubricating grease becomes solidified and it becomes almost rock hard. And when you try and rotate the volume control, it's really stiff to rotate. And what you need to do is just to pull off the volume control knob and then gain access to the locking nut, and you can remove the volume encoder. So here what I've done is I've desoldered it, and you can see internally. And what you need to do is just to spray contact cleaner in there and just keep rotating the spindle on the volume encoder. Now, some cases it will free up relatively quickly. Some cases you might be on this for 4 or 5 minutes or maybe more, but you just need to go backwards and forwards and just keep rotating. And really how this volume encoder should operate is that once all of that dried out grease has been removed, literally if you just touch it with your finger, you'll just be able to just rotate it, and it's absolutely smooth. And you can see the change in the volume on the display. Really, really smooth operation. So that is something that you need to do, and it's not difficult. Now, as with all of these amplifiers, you can also get the issue then with intermittent loss of sound. And that is attributed, as always, to the speaker protection relay. So this is a 24 volt DC coil, and it is a double pole relay, one for the left channel, one for the right, with single changeover. So again, no issue to source a replacement relay, and that was what was installed. There was no attempt to open this relay up or to clean the oxidized contacts inside. Now, the other thing to sort of focus on before we sort of wrap up this repair tutorial, you can see here that we have the dedicated power amplifier integrated circuit. Now, what you will find is that white grease that you can see there, and I'm indicating with the arrow, is the thermal transfer grease. And the objective there is that the back of the audio IC, and we'll get to that in a moment, is used to transfer heat away from the electronic circuit inside, because of course it's dissipating power. But that thermal transfer grease over time becomes dry and it almost has like a chalky feel to it. And that is also the same on the series voltage transistors. If you look on the left hand side, just next to the power IC, you can just make out those series regulator transistors. So here on this photograph, you can see what I've done is I've just removed the fixing screws and I've just moved it forward, and this is after, of course, the pins have been resoldered. I would not advise you to do this unless you've resoldered the pins on the IC, because there'll always be dry joints and you'll just make matters worse. And then what I do is I just use a plastic label removal tool and I will remove all of that old thermal transfer grease, and then I'll put brand new grease on. The same for the series regulator transistors. As I said a moment ago, you need to replace the thermal grease on there. So really, what was the main issues? Just to sort of recap, well, we had to replace the microcontroller because it had failed. We had to replace the display because the segments had become very, very dim because of oxidization internally within the display. To fix the issue with the intermittent loss of sound, we replaced the speaker protection relay, and we took care of all of the dry solder joints throughout the amplifier. And then there is no adjustment to make. With the audio power output IC, everything is already set, so you don't see any presets or any adjustments that you make. So once that has all been done and the amplifier has also been thoroughly cleaned, it's a simple matter then of just leaving the amplifier on test, normally for 3 to 4 hours, and just verifying that you have very, very good audio quality. Also as well, we check the solder joints on the headphone socket because again it's a stress point, and the headphone socket was also cleaned with De-Oxit D5, again just to make sure that you had no issues with intermittent loss of sound or a bad connection. And really, to restore these amplifiers is well worth the time. I'd say probably to do all of this work is normally about 3 hours in total to do a thorough job. And this of course had extra work because of the failure of the microcontroller. That is not a common thing, you do get it from time to time, but it's not something you see regular on these amplifiers. Normally it's the issue is associated with dry solder joints on the audio output IC and also the series voltage regulator transistors. So that brings us to the end of this repair tutorial. So I appreciate you stopping by. And again, as always, if you have any questions or you need any further assistance, by all means email Audio Amplifier Servicing at AOL.com and I'll be more than happy to come back to you and provide any guidance, assistance or support that you may require. So until the next time, I wish you all the very best. Cheers and bye-bye.